Okay, now we're going to do some sewing. When you're sewing in the studios, and certainly when you're sewing at home, the first thing you want to do is you want to test your machine to make sure it's running properly. Never set up a sewing machine and take your garment fabric and start right in. If it's not sewing properly, you can actually ruin your fabric and your garment, so make sure that it's running correctly. In the studio, I always have these little scraps of fabrics underneath the ironing board stations. Grab a scrap of fabric. Always make sure you're sewing on two thicknesses, because that's what I set the tensions up on the machine for. So take your fabric and test your machine out and check out your stitching, okay? And if you're working on a garment and you have your garment thread in and you're ready to go, make sure you take a scrap of your garment fabric and test it out first before you get started. There's some really important considerations such as needle size. If you're working on an organza, you're certainly going to want to have a smaller needle. All of those things are important to test first to make sure that it's working correctly before you get started. All right, let's start in. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to put my pressure foot down. Now there's a lever in the back here that you can see. I'm going to make sure that my pressure foot is down. If you're just beginning to sew, this is a really common problem. It's amazing how many times I see a stitch and it's just all completely loopy, and it's because the pressure foot has not gone down. Now this sewing machine has a knee mechanism to lift the pressure foot up, and this is the way I sew. The pressure foot's always down, and I use the knee mechanism to bring the pressure foot up and down, and that's important because then I can maneuver my fabric a little bit better. So now I'm going to test the machine out, and I'm going to run it. Okay. And I'm going to make sure that it's stitching correctly. And I'm actually going to show you what that should look like. But in the meantime, there's a little lever here off to the side that I'm going to press down, and I'm going to hold it down, and it goes backwards. Okay. When you're done sewing, take your hand wheel, make sure that your needle is all the way up to the top and is slightly on the downstroke. That will release your bobbin thread and your top thread, and it'll be a lot easier to pull your work out. Lift your pressure foot up and clip your thread. I'll do the same on this side. This is my habit. I like to get rid of thread the minute I sew. I don't like to see threads hanging off. Now let's take a look at your stitch. We have a nice even stitch here up at the top, and in the back it looks the same. This is the way it should be. Your upper and your lower thread should link like a chain, and that link should actually happen in the middle of your thread, in the middle of your two pieces of fabric here. So this is where the link forms, in the middle. If your top thread is not threaded correctly, when you go to look at your stitch, if your top thread is not threaded correctly, let's say it's not through the tension dial correctly, what you will see on the back is it will all be loopy. So if you have thread that is loopy on the back side of your stitch, it's actually your top thread that you're having trouble with. If you see the reverse and it's all loopy on the top of your stitch, then you're actually having trouble with your bobbin. So those are the indications that you're going to look at to start to troubleshoot when you're having trouble with your machine. Okay, so you always want to make sure that your machine is set up properly and that it's stitching correctly before you get started. If you're working in the studio and you don't have it stitching correctly and you don't have a nice even stitch top and bottom, first thing you're going to do is you're going to check and make sure that it is threaded appropriately, and if it's not, or if it is, come see me and I will work on the tension dial. This is actually your tension dial. So those of you at home, if you're looking at troubleshooting your home sewing machine, make sure that you know where your tension dial is, okay? If the thread is loopy at the bottom, which means that you're having trouble with your top thread, you're going to increase your tension, okay? And only do it in small increments, okay? Don't, dial away and thinking that that's going to help it. Do it in small increments until you have a good balance on your upper and your lower stitches. So you want to be careful with this. These things are usually preset, and you want to make sure that you're not screwing, messing it up too much, because then you're going to have, it's going to be very difficult to get back.